Dr. J. Franklin Schultz here with a police perspective, today on the subject of murder. As we enter into 2025, the final statistics for 2024 have been submitted and will be compiled, and 2024 statistics will not be released by the FBI until the fall of this year. So the most recent collection of annual average crime statistics are from 2023. And so let's take a look at those. And some of the things that I want to point out may or may not be somewhat interesting. First of all, one of the things that we see from the 2023 summary is that violent crime in general is reported to have gone down, and property crimes also are reported to have gone down, with the exception of motor vehicle theft, which is up pretty significantly. Now, one of the things that we need to remember about the UCR, without me giving a whole lecture about the Uniform Crime Report, with the NIBRS collection, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, is that these are crime statistics of the crimes that were reported by citizens to the police and then reported to the FBI. So obviously there are lots of unreported crime or misreported crime, and there is a little bit of wiggle room on how departments can actually define and submit the information. There are also some potential distortions that occur from the hierarchy rule. And for example, if you have several lesser included offenses, the highest offense will be the only one counted. And when we look at the specific crimes, we're going to see that there are cautions from the FBI on the FBI page about how to interpret the data and how not to assume that that reflects the local data. The other thing that I would say, in addition to, before we talk about murder specifically, the other thing that I would say is that there are lots of crimes that don't get very much attention in the publication of the annual report. So the UCR comes out in September or October, and they say murder's up, rape's up, whatever. And what is not counted in Part 1 crimes, but is counted in Part 2 crimes, are things like drunk driving, domestic violence, drug cases, vandalism, other misdemeanors, things that really are of perhaps greater concern with the average citizen than things that they think are not going to happen to them, like major felony crimes. Let's take a look at this statistic. And by the way, this is from 2019. Now, why is that from 2019 and not 2023? Because when NIBRS took over, which is a new and more detailed data collection system, they quit publishing things in the same way. So let's take a look at some, before we look at the total numbers for 2023, which is the most recent data, let's take a look at some trends and some general principles about the topic of murder. One of the things that I think is very significant and should have an impact on public policy but doesn't seem to is the type of weapons used in murders. So let's take a look. We see here a spread from 2015 to 2019, and again 2019 is the last time that we see this type of format available to you from the old crime reporting system. I'm not really a big fan of the way that you have to look for data on the new system, but it is what it is. So let's take 2019, and murders seem to have gone down somewhat over this period of time. And of those, let's say 14,000 murders, slightly over 10,000 of them were from firearms. And of the firearms, 6,000 of those were handguns. And again, of the 10,000, 364 were by rifles. Oh, wait a minute. I thought that assault weapons and scary looking rifles were killing people at a huge rate. Well, let's not minimize the use of long guns in some of the spree killings and mass attacks that have happened. But in reality, if you take a look at the numbers, the number of murders out of all of the murders that were committed using rifles, and this doesn't mean that they're necessarily all AR-15s or all AK-47s or all of the assault type military grade weapons that are reported. It could be a 22 rifle, a hunting rifle, etc. And while there certainly are cases where multiple rounds are fired through semi-automatic rifles with somewhat larger than usual capacity magazines, none of these are machine guns, all right? So I can't go through all the mythology that the people advocating for gun control, particularly aimed at AR-15s, scary rifles. But in terms of the actual number, the actual percentage of actual murders, we also have shotguns, which in 2019 were 200, and miscellaneous guns. And then there are some murders where we don't know what kind of gun was used. But let's then look at this number of knives out of those 14,000 homicides. Cutting instruments or knives were used in about 1,500 of those, or roughly 10%, a little bit more than 10% in 2019. So knives are dangerous. And again, relative to the number of rifles used in homicides, a huge disparity and much bigger threat. Blunt instruments, this is the kind of murder that you see on murder mysteries, the table leg, the crowbar, the lampstand, whatever. And then you'll notice that 600 of the almost 14,000 murders in 2019 were people who were just beaten to death with hands and fists. And so the number of people that were beaten to death just using hands and feet far exceeds the number of people murdered by rifles. Okay. Another interesting statistic is murder victims by age. And why is this significant? I have a keen interest in school shootings and assaults on schools, as all of us do, but I've studied it more than the average person and more than the average law enforcement officer and more than the average law enforcement executive. And while, again, we don't want to minimize any of the attacks on our schools, I just want us to get a little bit of insight about how much safer students are while they're in school than in other places, including the home. And I still believe that the home is the center of American fabric and society, and we need to trust parents and all those kinds of things. But let's just look at the numbers. Of the, again, this is 2019, almost 14,000 murders that year. When we see the rate of infants that were murdered, 154, and then kids from 1 to 4, 210. And I just want you to notice here that this is typically shaken baby syndrome. A lot of reasons why infants are killed, often by frustrated or drug influenced caregivers. And I say caregivers because a significant, if not the greatest percentage of children who are killed by non-biological caregivers. In other words, for the most part, bio moms and bio dads have more invested in the safety of their children than non-biological parents. Now, for those that are going to say, oh, are you making step parents evil or live-in boyfriends evil? I'm just saying the numbers are the numbers. And then we go from 1 to 4. And again, these are pretty challenging ages. I'm certainly not blaming child victims, but I'm saying that we often find that crying babies, hungry babies, attention craving kids, toddlers, potty training, that's a real high potential for violence against these little ones. But you see how these numbers go down from 5 to 8 and 9 to 12. And the reason is that now these kids, for one thing, they can articulate, they're verbal, so they can tell other people, and they're around other people, and they are in schools where there are mandatory reporting laws that say if you've got a kid who's being neglected or abused and you have evidence of it or suspicion of it, then you're mandated to report. So these are kids that are in school. These are not kids that are being killed in school. And again, we don't want to minimize those murders that do happen of youngsters in schools. But schools are still the safest place, and it's shown by the numbers here. Well, what happens from 13 to 16? Well, you know what happens from 13 to 16. They get a little bit more unsupervised, they get a little more independent, they get a little more experimental. And so we have these higher numbers in these vulnerable ages from 13 to 24. Another interesting thing that we might take a look at is justifiable homicide, and this is in particular dealing with law enforcement justifiable homicides. There's also a category of citizen self-defense cases, but in, let's say, 2019, you see that there were 340, which was citizens killed by police officers justifiably. And that number was actually down considerably from some previous years, but just roughly about one person a day is killed in exchange of gunfire with police officers. Not always gunfires. There are other ways that citizens might be the subject of deadly force by police officers. While we're talking about police officer involvement, there's also another component of the FBI's crime collection, which is LEOCA, law enforcement officers killed and assaulted. And one of the things that we want to note that what the categories that are excluded when you hear FBI numbers about police officers killed, that they exclude these types of folks. And you know, if you're going to have standards, you got to have standards, but we look to the ODMP, Officer Down Memorial Page, which is a private entity, but they are very good at including correctional officers, bailiffs, probation officers, and some other categories. One of the things that I want to point out is in these LEOCA statistics, here again, this is from 2019, they talk about 56,000 officers who were assaulted. That is such a wrong number, not because of anything that the FBI is doing wrong, but officer injuries and officer assaults are vastly underreported. In fact, if there are 750,000 cops out there, we don't have a really accurate number, and there are different categories, you know, reserve officers, special officers, part-time officers, a lot of different categories. So it's hard to count how many cops we actually have out there, but roughly 750,000, and we have an assault rate of 56,000. That's really not very much. That seems like a very safe profession, but it's just vastly underreported. In fact, I would say, other than when we look at some of the mechanisms, you know, how they get hurt, the extent of their injuries, and those kinds of things, that's helpful because this is probably a reasonably good sample for statistics, but that number is absolutely useless, absolutely worthless, absolutely underreported. It's not the FBI's fault, but we're just not doing a very good job. Now, another thing that I want to talk about just briefly is the clearance rate. And it's really a lot sadder than most people think. 2019, 45.5% of violent crimes and 17.2% of property crimes were cleared by arrest or exceptional means. Now, I will point this out that with the possible exception of murder, although there are serial offenders in murder, when you have other types of cases like the assaults and like rapes, and in property crimes, burglaries and thefts and armed robberies, 45% of the individual crimes are solved. But when you solve one crime, you have offenders that are committing multiple crimes, and so you're probably clearing for every burglary that you clear, for every burglary arrest that you clear, you are actually solving or arresting the perpetrator in many burglary crimes. Now, again, and these are property crimes, the solve rate for property crimes that were reported, and we know that a lot of burglaries are not reported, a lot of larcenies are not reported, a lot of arsons are not known to anybody that they really are arson. So there's a big dark figure out there about crime. But again, these are national averages of crimes that get reported to the police that report to the FBI. But about 95% of the population is covered by agencies that report to the FBI, but not all agencies report to NIBRS. It takes a lot of time, a lot of man hours to sort through all those reports and get all the data out and abide by the FBI data collection rules. And so some departments either don't or are not very good at being accurate in their reporting. But that's just the nature of research and statistics. particularly 61%, less than 62% of murder offenses are cleared. Wow. Most people are rather stunned by that. Now, that will vary from agency to agency. Some agencies have a lot higher success rates and some agencies have a lot lower success rates. Really depends on the demographics and the resources that are available. And in both violent and property crimes, smaller agencies and smaller populations actually have higher clearance rates for a variety of reasons. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to point out about murder is that of these, again, this is 2019, 14,000 roughly murders, 2,000 of those were victims who were being victimized by these other crimes. And when you look at the relationships, we find that you are much more likely to be killed by somebody who you know and or love than by being a random victim of murder from some other criminal activity. Let's look specifically at the at some 2023 crime statistics. Here's murder victim by weapon, by percent. Again, we see 3% of all homicides in 2023 were by rifle, same as being beaten by hands and fists, and a third less than being killed by a knife or other cutting instrument. Also want to point out that these are from 2023 and 2024, but here are high murder rate cities: Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, New Orleans, St. Louis, Detroit, Memphis, Cleveland. There are other cities with high rates. And you would have to do the math on this. I'm not going to do the math for you. You could probably find it online because somebody has. If you take the murders from these cities out of the average national murder rate, the average national murder rate is going to be much lower. So in other words, St. Louis, Detroit, Memphis, Cleveland, New Orleans, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, thank you for raising the murder rate. So hopefully that little insight and a little exploration of crime statistics regarding murder has been a little bit helpful and insightful, and that's a police perspective on murder.